Hi, everyone, and welcome back to our second panel of the Board of Directors Forum. My name is Lily Shin, and I'm a partner in Baker Bot's San Francisco office. I've spent my 20-year career focused on environmental law, first at the U.S. Department of Justice in the Environment and Criminal Divisions, and then in private practice, helping companies with compliance and enforcement defense. I'm very excited to moderate today's panel focused on evaluating ESG's impact on board decision-making in 2021. Last January, the world's largest asset manager, BlackRock, committed to making sustainability its new standard for investing. BlackRock's announcement underscores the growing importance of and movement towards a more formal and standardized approach to identifying financial risk and sustainable long-term profitability in the face of climate change, the energy transition, social justice, and other ESG issues. Today, we've convened a distinguished panel to discuss the challenges companies and their boards face when addressing ESG in a world where conditions are rapidly evolving, as we've seen over the last year. Let me do a quick introduction of our panelists, and then we're going to get right to the discussion. Kim Ann Mink is currently on the board of 3 global chemical companies, Air Liquide, Avient Corporation, and Eastman Chemical, and was most recently the president and CEO of Innophos Holdings. Jeffrey Hales is the Charles T. Vlachovich Centennial Professor of Accounting at UT Austin and the chair of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, which sets voluntary standards for disclosure of financially material sustainability information. And finally, Steve Solo is my partner in Baker Bot's DC office. He focuses on corporate compliance, business crimes, and environmental and civil litigation. Steve also brings his perspective as a court-appointed corporate monitor and former chief of environmental crimes in the U.S. Department of Justice. So there's been a lot of announcements, even over the last day, of changes in the ESG space. Yesterday, 3 of 5 of the New York public employee pension funds announced they were divesting $4 billion in fossil fuel companies. With the investor community increasingly focused on sustainable long-term profitability as opposed to short-term gains, how should boards help articulate and drive the business case for ESG under this standard? Kim Ann, let's start with you and your perspective as board member.
All right, thanks, Lily, and for the introduction. And it's truly a pleasure to be here today with the many Zoom attendees. Wish we could all be together. And I'm also honored to be on the panel with my 2 very esteemed colleagues, Steve and Jeffrey. So thanks again. You know, we've all heard this saying many times over, what a difference a year makes, right? And Lily, what a difference a day makes with the new things that came out this morning. And oh boy, that saying has real meaning on so many levels. And when considering a variety of topics in the context of the year through which we just navigated, and the topic of ESG is absolutely no exception. Now, although ESG, environmental, social, and governance matters have been on agenda items in corporate boardrooms for quite some time, you know, as Lily commented, institutional investors, not only BlackRock, but Vanguard, State Street, have particularly over the last year or so, has publicly placed intense focus on companies and their boards to really urgently make ESG a critical business priority as they look through their lens, if you will, of long-term profitability and value creation. And if the pressure from institutional investors isn't enough, the global pandemic has really further illuminated, if you will, environmental and social issues, which we'll probably discuss a bit later, that urgently need to be addressed. In addition, ESG issues are now not only on top of mind for our investors and shareholders, but other key company stakeholders, such as employees, the communities in which the companies operate, customers, business partners, and they're really all assessing more than ever before whether a company's ESG policies are consistent with their own values and their own purpose. And further, things couldn't be more complicated. The backdrop of ESG is really laced with complexity and includes a broad span of topics and ranging from climate change, including carbon emissions, to human capital, including health and safety issues, to corporate governance, which includes that pressing matter of board diversity. Knowing that humor helps, because I've used that throughout the year, I can clearly understand that while you're listening to this, while you're texting one of your colleagues at this very moment, that exploding emoji head, that yellow face with the open mouth, with the top of the head exploding in the shape of a brain-like mushroom cloud, that visual form of expression of mind blown, you're not alone. As a current director, like many of you, board oversight of ESG can at times be challenging and quite daunting. So as I prepared myself for entering the ranks of directorship on public boards and to really stay current on my journey as a director, you have to work hard at continuously improving your understanding of this very complex and ever-changing dynamic world of ESG. Devouring white papers from recognized authorities on best boardroom practices, whether it be NACD, PwC, KPMG, Deloitte. So to help articulate and then drive the business case for ESG, I quickly learned, and what I absolutely observed in practice across the boards on which I serve, a very pragmatic approach in which the management and the board of the company must first identify ESG opportunities and ESG risks. And what I mean, risks ranging from things like natural resource scarcity to supply chain disruptions, as well as operational and reputational risks. So really, you're looking at those risks and opportunities that are pertinent and material to that company. So you're defining what ESG means for the company, which of course, and I saw this across all the boards, are going to be different for every company in a sense and every board, because it's highly influenced by things like the industry and markets in which the company participates, the company's offering of products and services, global footprint, the principal concerns of the company's specific stakeholders. So for effective board oversight, it's then critical to link those ESG priorities to the company's strategy and the strategic plan, which includes things like mission, value, core values, operational tactics, and then link that also to enterprise risk management. Enterprise risk management, strategy, all of which falls under the purview of board oversight responsibilities. Then to hold management accountable for ESG risk management, and really to emphasize the criticality of ESG to company performance and strategy. It's really crucial then for the board to request routine updates on established ESG metrics, right? In fact, some boards are taking accountability one step further, linking it to executive compensation. And we saw earlier this month, Apple announced it will adjust 2021 bonuses for up to 10%, either way, based on the performance against social and environmental values. And then on a final note, to help facilitate ESG discussions between companies and investors, many companies are really looking for further recommendations on how best to standardize ESG disclosures within their industry, because the lack of required standards have posed some challenges. But I know we've got an expert on that, and I'd like to maybe pass the baton over to Jeffrey to maybe talk about that a bit.
Sure. Thanks, Kim Ann, and thanks everyone for being here today. So maybe to start off with, I would say, like, I completely agree with what Kim Ann was just conveying there, and in particular, like, I really like the importance of thinking about what is unique to your company, what is it important to be communicating, and how that should be ultimately relating to strategy and the opportunities that your company faces. Because at the end of the day, we're not interested in disclosure for compliance sake. This shouldn't just be an exercise in trying to avoid getting your hand slapped. It should really be a process of continuous improvement and what's best for your company, which, in the long term is what's best, generally speaking, for our society more broadly. So how do we kind of like link these things together? There is a lot of concern around the different approaches a company might take. Some of them are very bespoke, others are very narrow, and then there's a whole lot in between. And so it can be a little difficult to navigate. One thing I would say is that I think we're getting additional clarity on the way that the trade winds are blowing. And so I'll comment a little bit on that, but maybe just start off by saying, like, what do we do at SASB, and how do I think that links back to the sorts of things that Kim Ann was just calling for? So one, the approach that we take at SASB is that sustainability issues are business risks and business opportunities. That is what it is all about, and we broadly bucket them into environmental, social, human capital, and then some other related risks, but we think of it through that lens, but we don't say that there's just one particular issue that matters, or that all issues matter and all companies need to report on everything, because at the end of the day, you have to prioritize the resources that you're investing in trying to make progress in your company. So what are those issues? Well, what SASB has done over the last 8 years is think about what is a typical business model in a given industry. What exemplifies business in a particular industry. Investment banks are different than extractives companies, and even among the extractives companies, steel might be different than oil and gas. And so what we've done is reach out to companies, do research, talk to investors, and think about what are the issues that are most likely to rise to the level of financial materiality within those ESG ranges, or in that ESG space. And then think about, once we've identified those topics, what can we do then to help companies to facilitate a conversation with the capital markets around those issues. And so there we're looking for performance metrics. So we've developed industry-specific standards for 77 different industries. And with those standards, what we do is we have maybe 5 to 7 topics for any one industry, and then 2 or 3 performance metrics that would support it. And so, we could get into some detail on that. Maybe we will a bit later, but thinking about like human capital, it's an issue where we know that the SEC is encouraging companies to disclose more, but all they've said is like, at least tell us your head count, and then tell us the things that are important for your business. And we think actually that like companies can do one step better than that if they actually are reporting things that are going to be relevant for their company and that their peers can do in a comparable way, right? Because if you actually get comparable disclosures among peer companies, then you move from what's material to what's actually decision useful. And so, we feel like that's a really important role for standards, is to help to facilitate that decision useful communication. If every company is doing its best to communicate with its stakeholders or with your investors, that's great, but it's going to still create challenges for the marketplace. And so having a common layer of comparable disclosures that are relevant to your industry is, we feel like, an important part of that, although companies are always going to be able to layer on top of that the specific things that are relevant to them. So maybe I'll stop there for the moment. I know that I could go on and on, but we've got more panelists to get to.
One question, Jeffrey. There's no required disclosure standards now, and companies are faced with trying to pick and choose how to do that. And you mentioned a little bit about sort of, what the scuttlebutt is going to be on, in this new administration, and with, the new focus on ESG. What is it looking like for required disclosures? I think a lot of people would be interested in that.
Yeah. So quickly, just a couple of things on that. Well, first, I would say that there's the space of standards and frameworks is less chaotic than it might seem at first. A lot of it has to do with like what you're trying to accomplish as a company. But I think one thing, so there's more. There's more clarity to purpose than it might seem at first. It's more organized than you might think. But I think another thing that we're hearing is we're starting to see, especially in 2020, instead of just calls for more and better, specific calls. And so it started at the beginning of 2020 with State Street and BlackRock saying that they wanted companies to disclose in line with SASB and TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. We feel like those two go very well together. The year started with that. It ended with that, with like the 8 largest pension funds in Canada making a similar call, with the Board of Governors for the Investment Company Institute making a similar call, and so the marketplace is speaking not only with increased calls, but increased clarity. And so you're also then, as a result, also seeing increased momentum in the regulatory and legislative space as well. So, we've seen efforts like in Canada, a regulator there has proposed to require companies to disclose in line with SASB, for example, or encourage it. In the UK, the Financial Reporting Council encouraged companies to report in line with SASB and TCFD. So you're starting to see regulators align with what they're hearing from the institutional investors, from the capital markets. So I think you're going to hear more of that from the SEC. With the nomination of Gary Gensler, who still has to, of course, be confirmed. And I'm not an expert on this, so I'll let others opine on this. But it looks to be a potentially more aggressive agenda going forward in terms of like trying to move from a principles-based approach of just do better to maybe specific calls, although it's hard to see exactly which direction that would go in.
Well, and stay tuned for our last panel, because we'll have someone who's an SEC expert be able to opine on that. Steve, let me turn to you. Kim Ann talked about the importance of linking ESG with business strategy and strategic risk. And, as your role in a corporate monitor, you've seen sort of what happens, the flip side of that, when companies don't link those two together and what can happen. Talk a little bit about, what those risks are, particularly in the liability space and the litigation space, if companies don't focus and tie together ESG with strategic business strategy.
Thanks, Lily, and thanks to Kim and Jeff and to all my Baker colleagues for putting together this entire program. I'm very happy to be with you all today. Can you hear me okay? Because everyone else is frozen on my screen, by the way.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead,
Can you
Steve.
hear me? Okay. Everyone was frozen there for a bit. One of the things that I think is hard for directors in particular is to know whether they're getting the correct data. And I've sort of come up with a test to help you to see whether, in fact, you're getting the data that you need to serve the role you want to serve. And that is, if you've had a compliance-related issue in your organization in the last 2-3 years, whatever it might be, go back and look at what KPIs or what other reports you were getting and see whether or not that issue was being illuminated by that information. And if the answer is that it wasn't, which it probably wasn't, because if it had been, you would have done something about it, I think it's really important, and this is consistent with what Judge Strine was saying, to really look critically at the kind of information that is flowing to you from management and the value of that information. And to put it in another way, if you had one more hour to spend in assisting the organization in managing its risks and seeking its business imperatives, how can you best spend that time? And is the way that you're being asked to spend your time and the information you are being provided really, moving you in the direction you need to go? The other thing is that's been touched on by a couple of people that I want to underline is this notion of a whole of corporation approach, in effect, on these ESG issues. What we're seeing from the Biden administration is a whole of government approach to a range of issues that connect with ESG. And in keeping with that, I think it's important that you look and see whether or not you haven't unintentionally siloed some of these issues in a way that they don't get the kind of attention, the kind of engagement that they need. And so you need a whole of the board approach. There was a great question that was asked, and that was addressed during Judge Strine's talk, which is what items are significant that should be addressed by the full board. These issues, I think, are going to run through every aspect of the board, from audit to governance to compensation, and as looking at issues that relate to how management has driven these issues throughout its management approach. And so just stepping back for a moment and asking the questions that I just mentioned, I think, can be helpful for board members to examine whether they are getting the valuable information they need to help management and to help both move business imperatives forward on the positive side and managing risks on the potential litigation side. I want to pause there to see whether, to make sure that I'm actually being heard, because you all are still frozen for me.
Yes, we can. We do. We can hear you, Steve.
Great. And, you know, the last thing I would say before, stopping for a second is, have you felt challenged or uncomfortable as a board member by reports by the Audit or Investigation Committee? Because I would suggest that if you haven't in some way or another, then there may be a disconnect between what you are getting told about and what is actually challenging the organization. Because in general, there should be some things out there that require you to look a little harder or look a little more closely. And if that's not coming to your attention, that's an issue. And I do think that sometimes in this space, unfortunately, ESG becomes more a focus of the sort of external report writing and how it's presented. And I'll talk a little bit later about the risk that that presents for liability to an organization if that's the case.
Great, thanks, Steve. I wanted to pivot now and talk about what companies do in the ESG space when the risk of ESG is constantly evolving. This last year, as I mentioned in the introduction, has been like no other. The pandemic and its disparate impacts, the social justice movement sparked by George Floyd protests, and then continued impacts of climate change. I think it'd be interesting, Kim-Ann, to hear from you about how boards have changed their approach and evaluate ESG over this last year. How do they keep up with the pace of change?
Yeah, thanks, Lily. And I think I'll use as an example sort of the S component of ESG, which in the past, I would say has often been eclipsed by the environmental and government aspects. Interestingly, and I wanted to point to some data, between February to March 2020, I'm sure many of you participate in this, PwC conducted the annual Corporate Director Survey. The survey included 693 directors across more than a dozen industries. 76% of the respondents were men. On the topic of diversity, so that we're talking about a year ago, 84% of the board of directors said that they believe the companies should be doing more to promote gender and racial diversity in the workplace. But only 39% supported concrete measures, such as including diversity and inclusive goals in executive compensation plan. And only 34% considered a diverse boardroom important. And only 15% of male directors strongly agreed that board diversity enhances company performance. So again, what a difference a year makes. So we fast forward to a year, we have the continuing pandemic where women and racially and ethnically underrepresented workers have been disproportionately impacted by employment and promotion challenges. And protests over systemic racism have seemed to urgently illuminate diversity and inclusion issues across companies in the US. And quite frankly, they appear to be catalyzing efforts to address such issues. Now, of course, I need to mention, we know diversity goes well beyond race and gender. So really we need to be looking at, religion, political ideology, sexual orientation, physical abilities, age, socioeconomic status. And I really do want to point out, boards now really need to take and look at the difference between diversity and inclusion. And it's important to make a distinction between that. And many years ago, as we were sorting this out in our industry, I came across a quote, and I don't recall what the professor's name was. He was a professor at the Harvard Business School. And he stressed that diversity is about counting the numbers. So for example, to see what women and minorities are progressing to leadership posts. Inclusion is about making the number count. So it's about all individuals feeling heard, feeling cherished, and feeling equal. Now, BlackRock, again, ever changing, and we have to remain very agile on the board, has announced this year that they will push companies for a greater ethnic and gender diversity on their boards and in their workforces, and says that it will vote against directors who fail to act. And in fact, in a report late last year, they quoted, "An inclusive, diverse, and engaged workforce contributes to business continuity, innovation, and long-term value creation." State Street says it will also ask company about their metrics and goals to increase racial diversity within their ranks. In addition, NASDAQ announced that most companies listed in the U.S. Exchange will have to include at least one director who identifies as female and one who identifies as either an underrepresented minority or LGBTQ. So it's becoming ever important for boards to articulate and drive the business case for diversity and inclusion. But remember, only a year ago, 84% of those people who participated in the survey said they believe companies should be doing more, but yet only 34% considered diverse boardrooms such as that are important. Clearly, and it goes without saying, this is just the right thing to do. But a company's success and competitiveness, the business case, actually depend in part on its ability to embrace diversity and inclusion, and it realizes benefits. And we've seen this within our businesses, within our own boards. So it includes more effective execution. More effective execution results in higher productivity, profit, and return on investment. We see much more a variety of viewpoints when you have a diverse and inclusive workforce, which leads to more robust business strategy. Differences among the team increases adaptability. And that's adaptability to ever-changing fluctuation in markets and customer needs. So with the past events of 2020 and an urgent call for action from investors, diversity inclusion matters are actually now, and I'm seeing this in real time, finding a seat at the front table and more consistently at the top of the board agenda with other ESG matters. So as directors and management, and to coin a phrase that others have often used, we're really working at getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, because we're really facing things that might make people feel uncomfortable. We've got to face this. Now is the time. The journey can't be any longer than what we've had for so many years. So again, for effective board oversight and to really set that tone at the top, which is so critical, it's then imperative to link diversity and inclusion as boards do with other ESG priorities to the company strategy and the strategic plan. The diversity inclusion should be in that, just as other aspects of the E&G portion are. And it also includes our mission, core values, the purpose, and then link that to enterprise risk management. And when you look at risks like reputational risks, if we didn't do this, or litigation risks, if we handle diversity and inclusion in an inappropriate way. So to accelerate progress in diversity and inclusion, what I have been seeing is that boards are not only challenging their own composition, the tone at the top, you gotta, what is it? Walk the talk. The tone at the top starts with the board and the executive management team. We've got to look in the mirror. We've got to look at our own composition. But then companies, in conjunction with the board, are looking at lots of data, employee data, salary, promotions, turnover, and we're really trying to evaluate sort of that base, where we are, that starting point, and define areas for improvement. So with the focus on really also better understanding inclusion in company culture. Again, inclusion is different from diversity and probably a bit harder to measure. Companies are also conducting employee engagement surveys, right? Many are also requiring unconscious bias training. So all of this is happening at warp speed. But again, many companies are looking for further recommendations on how best to standardize diversity and inclusion or human capital type ESG disclosures, again, as the lack of standards have posed some challenges. So a lot going on at the board, but the year has really accelerated everything at the board and the company management level.
And Jeffrey, you mentioned that SASB has an area that focuses on human capital, which covers a lot of these issues. And, you know, in the diversity space, obviously, people have been reporting on diversity statistics for a long time, but I think the inclusion part, you know, how does a company measure that they are being inclusive, and how do you measure that that is addressing opportunities or risks that the company can, you know, are facing? So talk a little bit about how SASB deals with that issue and deals with just generally when risks emerge kind of, you know, not out of the blue, but like just become kind of critical and material. How do you deal with that when it's happening on such a fast time basis?
Yeah, so it's a great point. And, you know, one of the things I think about from a company's perspective is like, you have the hard job. You know, your job is to manage all the issues, no matter whether they are, you know, way down the road and you see them coming, or they come from the side without, you know, the ability or the benefit of a warning, right? And I think that's a bit what we felt this year, particularly with like the pandemic. But there were other issues, major issues this year, which you might have seen coming, but also maybe not with the clarity and force that they came this year. So as a standard setter, what we're really looking to do is try to find opportunities to create standards that can facilitate communication on an ongoing basis. You know, if you're going to invest in an information system that's going to gather data and report out and be able to use it to set performance benchmarks, you need it to be relevant for a reasonable period of time to get the benefit of that. And so we don't, as a standard setter, try to quickly come up with a standard for everything that might pop up, but we do try to think about what is likely to be a financial risk or opportunity going forward in a particular industry. And so for human capital, for example, you know, we often hear that every company has employees, so surely human capital is important for all companies. And like, yes, it is, but you could see the SEC struggling with what to ask of companies. They wanted to ask one thing of all companies, and the only thing they could come up with was headcount, right? Like that, well, you know, that's at least just tell us how many employees you have. And then the rest is principles based, because they didn't want to, or nor I think did they have the ability to really go beyond that. But what we've tried to do at SASB is to think about, well, what are some of the major human capital issues? So there are like labor practices, there's employee health and safety, there's the diversity, inclusion, employee engagement, supply chain management, which is a little outside of companies' direct responsibility, but still a very important risk and opportunity in some industries. So if you take something like incident rates or fatality rates, no company wants to have an employee hurt or die on the job, right? But that's been a regular thing that companies have managed for many, many years. It's, you know, one of the metrics that shows up frequently throughout our standards, depending on the industry, but certainly not in every industry. But this year did show that you know, literally the health and safety of employees and your customers matters in every single industry in certain circumstances. And so You know, as a university professor, as part of my day job, I mostly don't worry about dying at work, but, you know, like every person has to think about it this year. That doesn't mean that we're going to ask for, you know, fatality rates for all companies all going forward, because it's got to kind of relate to an ongoing, what we hope is the ongoing practice of what we ask of our employees going forward. So, you know, we have, for example, diversity and inclusion in our standards as well. It's something that, you know, hopefully we all can recognize as being appropriate. To, you treat your employees with an eye towards inclusiveness, that we don't discriminate based on race or ethnicity or gender. And yet, you know, if you think about the benefits of that, there are many benefits. It's the right thing to do, and then there are also like the benefits that can come from it, right? And so what we have seen in our standards as they were developed over the last, you know, 8 years, it was an issue that was prominent in some of our sectors, you know, but didn't actually show up in all of them. So in investment banking, the professional services, for example, we were identifying human capital, retaining talent is a really important issue. But we've recognized that, you know, the world that we live in today is not the same thing that the same world we lived in 8 years ago in a lot of ways. And so we've actually begun a process this last year of going back through our standards to look at human capital issues broadly, with a better understanding of how we can measure, identify what the issues are today, and look for where there is better measurement. I think, you know, we struggle with gender diversity is easy to measure. Well, actually, it's not. It's even that is not super easy, as we've kind of seen. But it is easier to deal with, especially on a global scale, than something like race or ethnic issues. That can be a real challenge to create meaningful metrics over, you know, for a company that has global operations, for example. But to Kim Ann's point, inclusiveness is also something that is a real challenge. And so, you know, frankly, like I haven't seen really great measures of it, although I think there are related metrics, like you could think about workforce culture, you know, thinking about measuring better employee engagement, things that actually might be close enough related to it that it could still be useful to try to capture. And so that's something that we're doing at TASB, is going back and looking at that. We actually have a stakeholder consultation through February 12th. If you've got somebody you want to direct to that, we'd love to hear input on what we're doing.
Thanks. Steve, let me turn to you, because the last comment about culture, and Kim Ann mentioned culture and tone at the top. I know that you've seen as a corporate monitor the real intersectionality between compliance, particularly in the ESG space, environmental, and culture and tone at the top, and how those are integrated. Talk a little bit about sort of your experience with that as a corporate monitor and how you've seen that impact a company's performance.
Sure, and sort of tying that back to my experience as a former enforcer, you know, recognizing that you know, liability for the organization can devolve down to, you know, the lowest paid employees, because they can vicariously mine the company. And so what is your most inexpensive risk management? Your most inexpensive risk management is an employee who puts their hand up and says, I think there's a problem here, right? And how do you empower them? Because you actually want them to do that, because you want the information coming to you before it goes anywhere else. And the answer does turn to all the issues that Kim and Jeff have been talking about, which is all the issues related to creating a workplace in which people feel respected, empowered, they see opportunities for advancement regardless of who they are or where they came from, and they become engaged with you. And, you know, working with multinational corporations, at times they'll make reference to issues related to, you know, dealing with people from different cultures. Well, at least based on what we've been looking at and talking with, you know, experts in the field of corporate culture, and who have done extensive psychometric polling in various organizations, your culture actually is the most important. That your culture, if you set it right in the way that Kim Ann talked about, if you push it and you focus on the standards that, Jeff talked about for your industry, your drive in that way will do more to affect how people view themselves and what they view as success within your organization than anything else. And that is hard to believe at times, but that seems to be true. And the risk when you don't do that, the risk when they become disengaged or lose that connection to your culture is the substitution of other things, the substitutions of other approaches, and the loss of a connection to what your core values may be. And so that is a key aspect to it. And if you don't do that, that is the risk. The other, thing that I was sort of touching on before is that all this discussion of reporting can be so overwhelming and occupying that we miss the fact that, as Kim said, you have to walk the walk and not just talk the talk. And what I worry about with some organizations is the tendency to write reports that sound good and present you in a positive way. And the question is, if you put those reports in front of your operational people, would they say, yeah, that's true. That is who we are. And because sometimes there is a disconnect between the desire to present these things in the most favorable way and the actual reality of what you're doing. And the reason I point that out is because from the point of view of enforcers, that disparity, that disconnect between what you said about yourself and what really to happen, not because it's intentional, but because it may be real, can really have an impact on how a government enforcer or by a shareholder litigator or by, and so I think those issues, the connection happening, something that has to be pressure tested on a pretty routine basis with people who really know, people at the, at the operational end of your efforts, because a disconnect in that space can really lead to people wanting to, in effect, take a more aggressive attitude toward you than they might otherwise.
Thanks, Steve. We have just about a little over 10 minutes left, and I wanted to turn to our last question now. With COVID-19 vaccinations increasing, I think the world's hopeful that it can turn its full focus back on economic recovery this year. And I think many organizations, countries are looking at this as this crisis that we're in right now as an opportunity to holistically reshape the economy. The Biden administration has pledged to, as part of its clean energy revolution, to prioritize federal resources in a way that's consistent with environmental and climate justice issues, and really target those resources for grants, incentives, such to shape an economy that they believe will be more sustainable in the long run. I'm wondering, with these kinds of prioritizations that may be happening not just in the US, but around the world, how should boards look at this kind of prioritization, and how should they change or pivot on their ESG strategy? And maybe I'll start with Kim Ann on this and sort of how you've been thinking about this as a board member.
Yeah, sure. Well, the Biden administration has made it clear. I think we've all saw it, that its 4 priorities, right, include racial injustice, climate action, economic opportunity, and public health. Many of the things we discussed today fall in those pillars, really. So it's clear then, as a board member, that ESG, diversity issues, will be even more of a priority if we didn't think it was before. So as a result, boards, my suggestion, very strong suggestion, should continue to increase their focus on ESG initiatives, not stop, not wait for someone to tell them something different to do. Not only the initiatives, but ensure that you've got the transparency, the disclosures, while staying engaged with all of your key stakeholders. And that will be very, very critical as we see new things come out with the Biden administration. So although I am not a chief political analyst, although I feel like we're kind of doing a CNN thing right now, under the Biden administration and reading some things as we prepare for, I have a number of board meetings coming up, and we're looking at these things, from tax rates to ESG issues and how that might change with the Biden administration. I think it's fair to anticipate proposals that establish probably some baseline requirements for diversity, gender equality, and worker representation in the board composition. So we'll have to wait and see. I think Jeffrey mentioned the nomination of the SEC chairman, Gary Gensler, and I know that it's not, I don't think it's gone to a Senate hearing yet, but it has been suggested that a Democratic-led SEC will most likely increase disclosure requirements by requiring, companies to disclose more information about whether it's risk related to climate change or workforce diversity. So it's really staying on top of that and learning how to pivot. And then the other one that came to mind is like the rejoining of the Paris Climate Agreement. It's expected then to stimulate further development of the clean energy industry in the US. So really all about sustainability. So there's going to be a lot of things happening on a daily basis, and it's critical that the government affairs in our many of our companies stay abreast of all of these situations.
I wanted to save a little bit of time for questions. So we've had a couple come in. And one of them deals with not just the impacts of ESG to company value, but really on the financial side, the risk to the financial system. And I know the Federal Reserve created a climate committee. They announced that yesterday to really look at those risks more closely. And one of the questions that was posed was, talk about how companies should think about ESG impacts on capital allocation, on, capital availability to them, given the focus on, by the financial system on these issues as well. And how do they look at that as a risk or opportunity? And I know Jeffrey or Steve, if you want to maybe to take one of those questions.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say like it's absolutely the right question to be asking. I think that companies can for a while longer continue to hide things that they don't want to talk about, but you cannot stop the market from asking questions that they believe they need to know about that will affect their willingness to hold shares in your company, to be a long-term investor in your company. So there are cost of capital, the availability of capital implications of that. But that, is, even if you want to take that risk, even that is something that you've got limited horizon to be able to do for all the reasons that Kim Ann mentioned in terms of like what we can probably expect going forward from a regulatory and potentially legislative approach as well.
Mm-hmm. Another question that has come in.
I mean, I would just.
Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, just the flow of our panel, to Kim's point, with Kim sort of laying out the broad strategy and the goals, and Jeff showing you the sort of the standards that by which you would measure them, and it ends up here with me. And I guess again, I would return to the issue of really looking at the value you are getting out of the reports that you're either generating for the board or receiving as a board member. And again, another measurement I would suggest is the speed of change, as Kim has pointed out, is just increasing, seemingly like this, the speed of microprocessor use. And you really need to look on a 3 to 6 month basis at the kind of reports you're getting and what movement you're seeing, because you really, in effect, can't afford, given the speed at which things are happening, to see things as being static in that space. And so the question is, how do you get ahead of what's flowing out? And again, I think it's important that from the board side, there really be the ability to have critical conversations with management to really push on the issue of, am I getting the information I need? Does it reflect the issues and the challenges we're facing? And what is being done about them? And I think, the impetus, from this panel, I think that is clear, is this is coming at you, and the best way to respond to it is to run toward it.
And I think that point kind of flows in nicely to one of the last questions I think we'll have time to address. And, you know, most boards have subcommittees, you know, audit, compensation, governance. I guess the question, ESG kind of overlaps with all of these, but then maybe also outside of the purview of these committees. It'd be interesting to hear the panelists' thoughts on whether, you know, do you expand the scope of some of these committees? Do you create a new committee to focus on specific intersectionality between these? That's, I think, something that all boards are wondering about to make sure that they have proper oversight over these issues.
Yeah,
I don't know who wants to take
really,
that first.
I can start with that. It's a great question because it has been a question on the boards on which I serve, and I see a lot of boards asking this question. The answer is one size doesn't fit all. Okay, so it's really going to be based on how you are structured from a committee standpoint, and sometimes committees are just taking on more, and actually you see certain name changes to reflect that. But I would say there's going to be some specific things that fall under nominating and corporate governance, like, for example, the idea of board diversity. That clearly falls in the purview of the nominating and corporate governance. When we talk about ERM and we're talking about looking at all the ESG risk, ERM is typically under the audit. We talk about the compensation committee and how we hold people accountable and perhaps putting metrics. That notwithstanding, I think we did come and there's some common thinking that although you've got these various items specifically in each committee's charter, and it's important, and Steve is going to keep me straight on this, we should reflect it in the charter to make sure that these things are being done. Because of the dynamic and the very complex ESG environment in which we live, we are bringing, and it's really converging back to the full board. And I think that's really important at this time as we're gaining our footing. So I know on the majority of my boards is many of this then converges back to the full board at a top at where we can share, because what you don't want is to get siloed at this point. We're not on autopilot by any stretch of the imagination.
And I would say, Kim, to your point that, you know, one of the key resources for the board is the board's own counsel. Yeah. You know, the board's independent counsel is the resource for the board, or should be able to be the resource for the board in critically analyzing these issues and providing counsel to the board independent of the general counsel and management's counsel, and having that separate source of information and a resource is critical to boards being able to take in and critically understand the flow of information they're getting on these issues in such a way that they can ask the questions they need to ask and get the answers they need to have.
Right. I think we are basically just out of time, so we're going to stop there. I want to thank all of our panelists today for a really lively discussion.